The year was 1888. In the lowland stretches of Arkansas, where the soil ran dark and fertile, and the river mist clung to the banks like a ghost reluctant to depart, one family's story settled like a rot into the annals of the county's memory. It is not remembered kindly. It is not remembered in hushed tones at firesides for its romance, nor for its defiance of societal order, but for the sickness it carried in its wake, the kind that leaves both bodies and reputation stained beyond cleansing. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. When the Heron family first arrived in Little River County, they carried themselves not as wanderers seeking survival, but as people who expected dominion over the land. The patriarch, Thomas Heron, was a man of 49 years, broad-shouldered though graying, who had uprooted his wife and children from Kentucky under the promise of a more prosperous planting life. Cotton had hollowed their Kentucky acres dry, and debts pressed in at his back. Arkansas promised renewal. His eldest son, Eli Heron, was at the brink of manhood, 21 years, wiry and solemn, yet still holding the kind of naivete that clung to boys raised in shadows of domineering fathers. His younger siblings, 3 sisters and 2 brothers, ranging from 10 to 17, seemed to scatter like sparrows under Thomas's watch, never daring to sit still long enough to be scolded. The family's matriarch, Martha Heron, remained silent, resigned. She carried her Bible like a shield, though its pages had worn thin, frayed by years of desperate fingering. The neighbors spoke with curiosity when the Herons took possession of an abandoned homestead near the fork of the river. It was a place remembered for failed crops, a house that had seen its first builder's children waste away from fever. Most families in that county held to superstition, unwilling to claim land that had tasted too much sorrow, but Thomas was practical, or arrogant, depending on the teller. "The land owes no debt to the dead," he said when warned. It was not long after their arrival that Eli met Clara Whitlock. She was the daughter of a middling farmer from a neighboring property, with a reputation for both gentleness and sharp intellect. At 19, she carried herself with a poise that seemed out of place among the rough fields and sagging porches of the county. Neighbors recalled her reading on the porch steps in the evening light, her dark hair pulled back, her face open and eager. She had suitors, but she dismissed them politely, preferring, it seemed, a man who carried thought as much as he carried strength. Eli was smitten, and unlike many farm boys who lingered too long in shy glances, he approached. Their courtship was marked, not by passion shouted to the rafters, but by quiet devotion. Long walks by the riverbank, shared baskets of food on Sundays, whispered talk of futures where they would break free from the old patterns their families demanded. Clara's parents consented to the union with little fuss. The Herons too approved, for Thomas saw the Whitlock holdings as useful ties, and marriage as a transaction as much as a covenant. Yet beneath the polite exchanges and handshakes, something darker began to stir. The first unease was observed, not by Eli nor Clara but by Martha. She noticed how her husband lingered when Clara visited, how his voice softened when he addressed her. At first she dismissed it as her own mind weaving suspicions where none exist, but as the summer lengthened and the preparations for marriage advanced, Thomas's presence began to trouble the household. He insisted on overseeing the building of a new cabin meant for Eli and Clara, though the task might easily have been left to neighbors or hired help. He took to sitting on the porch in the evenings, waiting for her visits, his face lit by the lamplight as though expecting a confidant. And once, when Clara rose to leave, Martha noted the way his hand lingered against hers, a shade too long, a shade too familiar. The wedding was set for late September. The river swelled with autumn rains, the fields pressed with the burden of harvest. Preparations were made in both families, linen sewn, food preserved. The preacher called upon. To the county, it was an event like any other, a joining of 2 respectable families, yet beneath, the soil of suspicion began to shift. Neighbors whispered first. It was a neighbor's wife, Sarah Galt, who confided to a cousin that she had seen Thomas Heron alone with Clara at the well behind the Whitlock property. Clara had looked uneasy, even frightened, though Thomas's expression was hidden by the brim of his hat. Eli, oblivious, busied himself with his work. More whispers followed. Children claimed to have overheard Thomas's voice on the road at night, low and urgent, speaking with someone unseen. Some said it was Clara, others insisted it was no more than a farmhand. But the rumor grew, as such things do in small counties, feeding on the marrow of suggestion. Clara too seemed changed. Where once her face shone openly, Now her eyes darted toward the ground when Thomas entered a room. She spoke less, ate less, and her mother noted the hollows forming beneath her cheekbones. Eli saw but mistook it for nerves before a wedding. He was a gentle boy, eager to shield her from hardship, and too naive to imagine betrayal from his own father. The Heron house itself became heavy with a silence that crept into its corners. Martha prayed longer at night, kneeling on cracked wooden boards until her knees were bruised. She longed to speak, to warn her son, or to confront her husband, but words caught in her throat. To accuse Thomas was to bring ruin upon the family, and she had lived long enough to know that women's voices were not always believed, particularly when pitched against a man who held land, children and reputation in his grip. The autumn air cooled. The wedding day drew close. Invitations had been sent. The preacher prepared his sermon, but within the Heron household, a storm brewed, quiet and suffocating, like a sickness incubating behind closed doors. By late September, Clara's health declined further. She was pale, often clutching her stomach as though gripped by some inner wound. Her mother, distressed, suggested postponing the wedding until her strength returned, but Thomas objected, sharply, with an insistence that startled those who heard him. "The wedding will proceed," he said. "Delays breed doubt, and doubt has no place in covenant." It was then that the Whitlocks began to wonder, not openly, but in muttered conversations at the edge of night, whether Thomas's motives stretched beyond the respectable. They saw the way his eyes followed Clara, the way his words carried weight not of a father-in-law-to-be, but of a man with a claim not his own. And as the day approached, the county held its breath, sensing that what was meant to be a celebration of youth and union had already soured into something else, something forbidden, something that would scar them all. The day fixed for the union came, September. It was a Thursday, and though the skies carried no storm, there lingered in the air that strange stillness, as though nature itself anticipated disorder. Families from across Little River County arrived on horseback and carriages, on foot, all gathered to witness the Whitlock girls' wedding to young Eli Heron. The Whitlock house, modest but well-kept, was decorated with garlands of cotton balls, tied with strips of cloth. Neighbors brought pies, preserves, and jugs of cider, filling the air with the smells of cinnamon, apple, and smoke from the outdoor fire pit. Children ran between the trees, laughing. The preacher stood ready with his Bible, its worn leather spine catching the light. Yet amid this cheer, Clara appeared wan. Her dress, white linen stitched by her mother's hands, hung loosely upon her frame, her cheeks sunken. The eyes that once caught Eli's heart no longer shone, but shifted restlessly, searching the crowd as if expecting an escape. Eli, in his best coat, smiled nervously. He whispered to her, urging comfort, but her hands trembled in his. The guests, noticing her pale condition, murmured sympathetically. They blamed illness, nerves, perhaps a woman's ordinary weakness before the strain of ceremony. Only a few, the sharp-eyed, the suspicious, saw the shadows passing between Clara and Thomas Heron. It was when the vows began that the disturbance occurred. The preacher's voice, steady and low, asked Clara whether she would take Eli Heron to be her husband. Clara hesitated, not for seconds, but for a silence that dragged long enough for whispers to stir among the gathered. Her lips parted, her throat moved, yet no sound emerged. Eli's hand tightened upon hers. He whispered again, pleading. She glanced sideways, not at him, but at his father. Thomas's eyes were fixed upon her, unblinking, as though his will alone might dictate her answer. The onlookers shifted uneasily. Some would later swear that Thomas's expression was one of hunger, of possession barely masked. Finally, Clara forced the word, but the sound carried no conviction. It was faint, frail, like the cry of a bird trapped in a hunter's hand. The preacher turned to Eli, who gave his own vows swiftly, eagerly, his voice breaking with youth. And so, by ritual alone they were bound. Applause scattered the air, but it was thin, uncertain, for the congregation had felt the fracture in that moment. A ceremony of shadows rather than light. The feast proceeded, though unease hung over it. Clara did not eat, only sipped water. She grew pale enough that her mother begged to take her to rest. Thomas objected. He insisted she remain, that the bride's presence was required to honor the guests. His tone brooked no refusal. Even Eli deferred, unwilling to contradict his father in front of the crowd. By twilight the celebration soured. A quarrel broke out between two distant cousins over a jug of cider. Dogs barked. The air thickened with humidity and smoke from the fire pit. When Clara finally rose from the table, she swayed, clutching her son. Martha Heron moved instinctively to her, but Thomas intercepted, lifting Clara's arm to steady her, leading her away himself. That image fixed itself into the memory of those who witnessed it, not Eli, the groom, but Thomas, the father, guiding Clara away from her own wedding feast. Some whispered, some chose silence, but none would ever forget. The night should have closed with merriment, but by dawn disaster had struck. Clara collapsed in her chamber, feverish, racked with chills. Her stomach pains grew unbearable. A doctor was summoned from across the county, who declared it a sudden malady of the gut, perhaps from spoiled food or nervous strain, yet suspicion crept swiftly. Martha Harron, watching from the doorway, saw Clara's lips move in weak protest. When Thomas entered the room, saw how the girl's body shrank from his touch. She tried to speak, to beg the doctor or the Whitlocks to keep Thomas away, but her tongue was tied by fear. Clara lingered in agony for 3 days. Eli remained faithfully at her side, though bewildered and helpless, unable to comprehend the shadow that hung over his new marriage. On the 4th night, her breathing stilled. The county awoke to tragedy. Clara Whitlock Harron, dead not a week into marriage. The funeral was swift, carried out in the humid September air. Her body, wrapped in white, was laid in the Whitlock family plot. The preacher spoke of frailty, of the mysterious will of God. Eli stood stricken, silent, tears streaking his face. Martha wept openly, but Thomas stood with an expression unreadable, not grief, not rage, but something harder, something determined. His gaze did not linger on the coffin, it lingered on Eli. What followed in the weeks after Clara's burial confounded even the most charitable neighbor, for instead of withdrawing in mourning, Thomas Harron began to visit the Whitlock farm frequently, too frequently. He offered assistance, provisions, coin for what they had lost, and though the Whitlocks at first accepted, necessity compelling them, they soon grew wary. By November, whispers spread like infection. Thomas Harron had claimed Clara not as daughter-in-law, but as his own, that he had pursued her in secret long before the wedding day, that her illness was no ordinary fever, but poison administered to rid Eli of her, to clear the path for Thomas himself. No proof existed. The doctor had signed the death record with simple cause, congestion of the stomach, yet in every corner of the county, tongues wagged. Men spat the name Harron with contempt. Women crossed themselves when his carriage passed, and Eli, broken, humiliated, bound still by filial obedience, carried the shame like a millstone. His eyes grew hollow. He labored silently in the fields, his back bent, his voice seldom heard. Where once he had dreamed of a future with Clara, he now lived under the shadow of his father, unable to speak the truth even to himself. By winter, the Harron family stood divided. The younger children whispered of leaving, of running from their father's grave. Martha's prayers deepened into near madness, her Bible pages streaked with tears. Neighbors, once cordial, now crossed the road rather than meet Thomas in passing. The Whitlocks, ruined by grief, spoke less and less. Clara's mother fell ill, bedridden with sorrow. Her father, once a sturdy farmer, aged a decade in months. Their home grew silent, the hearth seldom lit, and still Thomas prospered. His fields yielded, his debts lessened. He carried himself with pride, as though the scandal that haunted the county was beneath his note. The world respects strength, he told a neighbor. Weakness is a curse that devours itself. It was this arrogance that bound his name forever to the tale, for in a land where memory clings like moss, no one forgets the man who took his son's bride and let her waste into the earth. Yet this was not the end, for the story of Thomas Harron and the forbidden marriage did not conclude with Clara's burial. It only deep records unearthed decades later, testimonies whispered in secrecy, would reveal more practices, experiments, corruptions of the body and soul that stained not only Thomas, but the Harron line entire. This was only the beginning. Among the records that survive from Little River County in the late 1880s, few are more haunting than the papers of Father Jeremiah O'Rourke, the parish priest, who presided over both the Harron and Whitlock household. His journal entries, preserved by the diocese, and only unearthed years later, provide testimony not of rumor, but of observation, careful, weary, and reluctant. The first note dates to October 6, 1888, scarcely a fortnight after Clara's burial. O'Rourke wrote of being summoned to the Whitlock farm. He found Mrs. Whitlock in a state of decline, pale and trembling, repeating again and again that her daughter had not died of illness, but of something given to her. Her words were not coherent accusation, but the babble of grief, yet they chilled the priest enough to put pen to page. He recorded, "The girl was too young, too healthy. No fever should have carried her so quickly. Her lips were blistered, her breath sour, her stomach convulsed. It is not the mark of ague, nor of any fever known to this county. I cannot name it,
Yet I fear it was not the Lord who called her, but man. Through October and November, O'Rourke made repeated visits to the Harren homestead. Each time he observed Eli, once eager in faith, no longer attended mass. His eyes, O'Rourke noted, were drained of hope, shadowed with a grief too heavy for a youth. The younger children avoided their father's presence, scattering whenever his boots struck the floorboard. Martha kept to her room, whispering prayers until her lips bled. And Thomas himself, O'Rourke described him as transformed. Where once he had spoken humbly of debts and crops, he now carried himself with a strange authority, almost regal, as though Clara's death had not diminished, but elevated him. He spoke not of mourning, but of inheritance, legacy, and the purification of the bloodline.
By December the rumors had grown too loud to ignore. A neighbor, Margaret Colton, confessed to O'Rourke that she had once seen Thomas and Clara together in the woods near the river, weeks before the wedding. Clara's face had been pale, frightened. Thomas's hand pressed against her arm, restraining her. Margaret had told no one, for who would believe a woman's word against a man of standing? Yet when Clara died, the memory gnawed at her until she could bear the silence no longer. O'Rourke's journal recorded this with unease. If this is true, then the father did not covet only the land, nor the reputation of his son, but the bride herself. Such a sin against God, against nature, cannot be spoken lightly, yet I sense it lies at the root of the sickness consuming both households. The most damning testimony, however, came from Martha Harren herself. In a private confession, one O'Rourke was bound by duty not to disclose during his lifetime, she revealed her suspicions with trembling certainty. She told him of how Thomas lingered near Clara, how his hand once brushed against her hair in a gesture far too intimate. She told of nights when Clara came to her kitchen under pretense of fetching water, only to sit silently at the table, eyes brimming, refusing to say what troubled her. And she told of the night before the wedding, when she found her husband in the outer shed, mixing a powder into a jug of cider. He had startled when she entered, and claimed it was only medicine for the mules. She had believed him then, or perhaps forced herself to. But when Clara sickened, when her lips blistered and her breath soured, Martha knew she had seen the preparation of the poison with her own eye. This confession, though sealed within O'Rourke's journal, explains much of what followed. For Martha's knowledge became a burden too heavy to bear. In later years, she would succumb to what doctors called nervous collapse, though those close to her named it madness. It began, surely, with the silent knowledge that her husband had murdered her son's bride. O'Rourke himself admitted his own paralysis. "What power has a priest in the face of such evil?" he wrote. "The county whispers, but no man comes forward. The son is bound by fear, the mother is silenced by dread. And I, charged to speak truth, am shackled by the seal of confession. I fear the devil has bound this household with cords stronger than iron." One chilling detail appears in a later entry. O'Rourke wrote that he was called to the Harren home under the pretense of blessing the house for Christmas. In the front room he found Thomas seated at the table with Eli. Between them lay a Bible and a knife. Thomas instructed Eli to place his hand upon the scripture and swear obedience to him in all things, swearing that he would never repeat the rumors spread by the county. Eli's hand shook, but he complied. Thomas then drew the blade across the palm of his own hand and pressed the wound to the Bible, smearing blood across the page. O'Rourke recorded his horror. The book was defiled, not an oath unto God, but a covenant unto man. I could not intervene without endangering the boy. I departed with sickness in my spirit. I fear what darkness now governs that household. Meanwhile the Whitlocks sank into ruin. Clara's mother, bedridden with grief, spoke deliriously of her daughter's ghost, of footsteps pacing the upper rooms at night. Her father's fields withered, debts mounted. By January of 1889, the Whitlocks had lost nearly all standing in the county. Some believed it divine punishment for their complicity. Others said it was the silent vengeance of Thomas Harren's hand. And yet, the Harren farm prospered. Cotton yielded abundantly. Livestock multiplied. Neighbors remarked that even in winter's lean months, Thomas's stores seemed full. His children fed. His barns stacked. Superstition began to swirl. That he had made a pact. That his prosperity was purchased not by labor, but by something darker. Father O'Rourke's final entry on the matter, before he ceased mention altogether, is dated January 14th. He wrote, "I no longer doubt, the death of Clara was not accident, nor illness. It was the hand of Thomas, driven by lust and pride. I hear now from Martha that he speaks openly of bloodlines, of keeping what is his, of no man, not even his son, taking from him what he desires. She fears for the children, she fears for herself. She begged me to intervene, but what is my power? The law will not act without proof, and proof has been buried with Clara. I fear more graves will be needed before the truth is known. After that, the journals fall silent on the Herons. Whether O'Rourke chose to protect himself, or whether the darkness of the family became too dangerous to record, we cannot know. But what is clear is this. By the early months of 1889, the county no longer spoke of a forbidden marriage as rumor. It was acknowledged as fact. The father had stolen his son's bride, and in doing so, had poisoned not only her body, but the veins of every soul bound to him. October 19th, 1888, dawned clear and cold. After weeks of drizzle and sodden ground, the air now carried a crisp edge, and the fields lay silvered with frost. The date was meant for joy, the day before Eli Heron's wedding. But within the Heron household, the morning unfolded with a strange, rehearsed precision, as if each family member played a role in a script already written. Thomas announced at breakfast that he had arranged a farewell hunt for Eli, a tradition among some of the county's young men before marriage. He spoke of it lightly, as if it were mere sport, but Martha's hands trembled as she poured coffee. She asked why Eli must hunt when he was still weak from his recent illness. Thomas replied that fresh air would restore his constitution, and that a man on the brink of marriage should prove himself in the field, not in bed. The neighbors, accustomed to Thomas's authority, accepted the invitation without question. Guns were oiled, dogs leashed, and by mid-morning the party had gathered at the edge of the Heron Wood. From testimony later recorded by Samuel Baird, one of the men present, Eli appeared pale and unsteady, yet eager to please. He laughed too loudly, stumbled on roots, and carried his rifle as though it weighed twice its proper heft. The others jested about his nerves, attributing them to the wedding night ahead. Only Baird noted how his skin bore a sickly yellow cast, how his hands trembled even when no chill wind blew. Thomas led the hunt, striding ahead with vigor. He pointed out game trails, set the dogs loose, and urged his son to take the first shot when a deer bolted through the brush. Eli raised his rifle, fired, and missed so widely that the others exchanged uneasy glances. More shots were loosed through the morning, yet Eli hit nothing. At noon, Thomas declared they should press deeper into the woods. The ground sloped treacherously here, the undergrowth thick, the air still. It was in this place, Baird swore, that the accident occurred. Accounts differ, as they often do when truth is clouded by fear. Some said Eli stumbled, his rifle discharging into his chest. Others claimed Thomas's shot struck the deer but passed through, felling his son by mischance. And still others whispered that no animal had been in sight at all, that Thomas turned deliberately, aimed, and fired. What is certain is that the blast shattered the autumn silence. Eli fell. His cry was brief, cut short by blood that filled his mouth. He lay gasping, eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his mother's nightmares. By the time the men reached him, he was already dying. Thomas knelt beside him, pressing a cloth to the wound, calling for help. Yet Baird swore his tone lacked urgency, that his eyes shone not with grief, but with grim satisfaction. Eli's last words, heard by two men, were strange. He whispered, "Tell mother it was not my fault." Then he was still. The body was carried back to the homestead in silence. Martha, upon seeing her son's lifeless form, collapsed. She clawed at the bloodied coat, crying that she had warned them, that her son was not fit for the hunt. Thomas silenced her with a look so fierce that even the neighbors turned their eyes away. That evening, as the men gathered in the parlor to recount the accident, Thomas spoke steadily. He praised Eli's courage, spoke of the dangers of firearms, and framed the event as a tragic but natural misfortune. His words carried weight. None dared contradict him. The county would record it as an accident. Yet O'Rourke, visiting the house that night, saw different. He described in his journal how Thomas poured brandy freely, insisting all drink to Eli's memory. But when Martha raised her glass, her hand shook so violently that the liquor spilled across the floor. She whispered to the priest, barely audible, "It was not the gun, it was the poison. He killed him long before today." In the days that followed, the household was consumed with arrangements. Clara was buried in her family plot. Now Eli's grave was dug beside hers. The two who should have joined in marriage were instead united in death. At the funeral, Father O'Rourke's homily faltered.
He spoke of sins that walk among us, and justice that belongs only to God. Many parishioners wept. Others glanced uneasily toward Thomas, who stood tall at the head of the coffin, his hand resting possessively on Rose Whitlock's shoulder. Yes, Rose was there, though widowed in spirit. Though her betrothal had ended in a grave, she did not Instead she remained at Thomas's side, dressed in dark mourning attire, her face pale but composed. To some it seemed the posture of a dutiful daughter-in-law. To others, it was the stance of a woman already claimed. By November, rumors had hardened into certainty among the county's gossips. They said Eli's illness had been no fever but a careful poisoning. They said Thomas had lusted after Rose from the first, and that Clara's sudden death was not coincidence, but elimination. They said the hunt was staged, the accident rehearsed. Margaret Colton, ever the busybody, declared openly at market that she would not permit her daughters near the Heron place. That house, she said, feeds on its own blood. Few contradicted her, yet for all the whispers, no charge was brought. The law required witnesses, evidence, testimony under oath, and who among the neighbors would dare speak against Thomas Heron, a man of wealth, connections and ruthless temper? The silence of the county was its complicity. The marriage that had been forbidden was soon replaced by another union, one more unholy still. Before winter ended, Rose moved into the Heron household under the pretense of assisting Martha in her grief. By spring, she was openly regarded as Thomas's companion. Some claimed the ceremony was performed in secret. Others believed no vows were spoken at all. What mattered was that Rose was his, and the shadow of Eli was erased. But the shadow of Clara remained. Several visitors swore they saw her figure at dusk, pacing near the Whitlock fence line. The dogs barked at nothing. The youngest Heron children woke screaming that a woman stood at their bedside, face pale, lips blistered, and Martha, poor Martha, descended swiftly into madness. She wandered the fields at night, calling Eli's name. She tore pages from her Bible, muttering that it was stained with her husband's blood. At last, she was confined to an upstairs room, where she rocked endlessly in her chair, whispering of powders, of cider, of a hand that stirred death into every cup. So the story fixed itself in county law. A father who took his son's bride, a mother broken by knowledge she could not speak, a son silenced by both poison and powder shot. Years later, when the Heron name still carried influence, the whispers had not ceased. They said the blood of the family was tainted, that every misfortune traced back to that October morning when Thomas raised his rifle and fired. And though the record books call it accident, the journals of Father O'Rourke, the ravings of Martha, and the trembling testimony of Samuel Baird tell otherwise. They tell of murder concealed beneath the thin veil of tradition, and of a marriage forbidden not by law but by God and conscience. In the months following Eli's burial, the Heron house underwent a transformation that was subtle yet unmistakable to those who frequented its threshold. Curtains were drawn more tightly, shutters barred earlier in the evening, and servants were dismissed under peculiar circumstances. The place once known for its open hearth and neighborly suppers became instead a fortress of silence. Thomas explained these changes as the necessities of grief, yet Father O'Rourke in his private writings insisted the home had become a laboratory of control, a place where the walls themselves seemed to listen. It was in this period that the priest began collecting what he called records of affliction. He copied testimonies, noted illnesses, and preserved fragments of letters. These papers, though fragmentary, provide our clearest view of the family's descent. One such document is Martha Heron's letter to her cousin in Little Rock, dated January 7. Though never sent, the draft was discovered decades later, folded into the spine of her Bible. It reads, "I cannot rid myself of the smell of brimstone in this house. Every cup I drink tastes of bitterness." He says it is only my nerves, yet I know the taste of poison, for I saw it in Eli's eyes before he fell. Rose walks the halls like a bride, yet no bells have rung. She takes my place at the table. She answers when my children call for me. They say I am unwell. Perhaps I am, yet it is not sickness of the body, but of the soul, and it was planted in me the day Thomas fired upon our son. The handwriting falters halfway down the page, and the last lines descend into jagged scratches. Equally disturbing are the notes left by Samuel Baird, who, unable to silence his conscience, confided in a traveling physician. Baird described in detail the moment Eli collapsed in the woods. "I have hunted since I was a boy," he wrote, "and I know the sound of a bullet striking bone." Eli was not felled by accident. The shot was placed true, as a man aims not at a deer but at a mark he intends. And when Eli fell, Thomas knelt beside him, not with grief, but with the composure of a man receiving the fruit of his labor. This testimony was never given under oath. Baird later retracted his words, claiming drink had clouded his memory, yet the physician, unsettled by the account, preserved the notes in his ledger, where they remained long after Baird himself had passed. Rose Whitlock's place in the household deepened through the winter. She took charge of the younger children, overseeing their lessons and their meals, while Martha languished upstairs. At first, neighbors pitied her, imagining her duty as noble, but as weeks turned to months, pity shifted to unease. Visitors noticed how Rose spoke with the authority of a mistress, not a guest. She sat at Thomas's right hand, directed the servants and even corrected the children when they addressed Martha instead of herself. Most troubling of all was her appearance. Witnesses said her beauty grew unnaturally sharp in those days, as if grief had not withered her, but refined her. Her cheeks flushed where Martha's paled, her eyes shone where Martha's dimmed. The more the elder wife withered upstairs, the more the younger woman seemed to thrive. In February, O'Rourke wrote of a parish visit that chilled him to the marrow. He had come to deliver Lenten blessings. Upon entering the Heron home, he found Rose and Thomas in the parlor, seated close, their hands clasped, though they made no effort to withdraw them when he entered. Martha, meanwhile, was absent. When asked, Rose explained she was resting upstairs, but O'Rourke, disturbed, excused himself and ascended the staircase alone. He found Martha seated in her chair, her lap covered with torn pages of scripture. She was muttering, over and over, "The fourth cup, the fourth cup." He made him drink it. When the priest asked her meaning, she clutched his sleeve with unexpected strength. "Father, I saw him mix it. I smelt the powder." Eli drank the fourth cup, and it burned him from within. That was before the hunt, before the shot. Do not believe the story. The poison killed him first.
Her words were disjointed, but the conviction in her eyes was unmistakable. O'Rourke recorded them in his journal that evening. By spring of 1889, the county whispered of curses. Some said the Heron farm yielded half its usual crop. Others claimed their cattle sickened and bore calves with twisted limbs. A farmhand who left their employ insisted that the water from the Heron well had turned foul, black with an oily sheen. It is tempting to dismiss such tales as the embroidery of superstition, yet their persistence suggests a deeper unease, that the land itself recoiled at the sins committed upon it. Among the most curious records is an entry in the ledger of Dr. James Holcomb, the county physician. Dated March 1889, it notes, "Called to the Heron residence for complaint of gastric distress in Mrs. Heron Martha. Patient pale, pupils dilated, pulse irregular. Symptoms suggest ingestion of corrosive substance." When asked if she had consumed spoiled food or tonic, she replied, "It was in the broth. He feeds me as he fed Eli." Administered emetic, partial relief observed. Strong suspicion of chronic poisoning, though unable to prove. Holcomb's entry ends with the cautionary remark, "Recommend discreet watch upon the household." Yet no further official action was taken. The Heron children fared little better. In April, their eldest daughter, Ruth, wrote to her schoolmistress, "I cannot sleep in this house. When I close my eyes, I hear Clara's voice in the hall singing the hymn she favored. Father says it is the wind. Rose says it is imagination, but I know it is Clara, for when I listen closely, she calls not for me but for Eli, and her song breaks into weeping." This letter was preserved only because the mistress, fearing impropriety, forwarded it to O'Rourke. He placed it among his growing archive of what he termed afflictions of conscience and body. By May, the household's decay could no longer be denied. Martha, once the quiet strength of the farm, was confined entirely to her chamber. She had lost weight, her teeth yellowed, her nails blackened at the edges. Servants whispered that she coughed blood into her handkerchief. Thomas forbade talk of her illness, insisting she was merely delicate. Rose, conversely, seemed to bloom. Her figure filled, her complexion glowed. Some suspected she carried Thomas's child, though none dared ask. When Martha attempted to confront her husband one final time, shouting from her chamber door that he had murdered their son, Thomas struck her, a fact later confirmed by a dismissed maid. From that night onward, her voice was never again heard in the hall. The final record of that season is the most chilling of all. O'Rourke, compelled by conscience, visited the Herons at Pentecost. He described entering the parlor to find Thomas and Rose seated by the hearth, with the children gathered at their feet. Rose was teaching them a hymn, her voice sweet and steady, yet what froze O'Rourke was the sight of Eli's rifle mounted above the mantel. It had been polished, its stock oiled, its barrel gleaming as if newly forged. When the priest asked why they displayed such a weapon, the very one that had brought Eli's death, Thomas smiled and replied, "Because it took him from us, and gave her to me." The priest wrote that he fled the house with his heart pounding, convinced that Satan himself had taken residence within its walls. Thus, by mid-1889, the Heron story was no longer whispered as tragedy but recounted as warning. Parents forbade their daughters to approach the farm. Men avoided Thomas in town. The family had wealth, but not respect. Their affliction was no longer private. It had entered the life of the community, a contamination spreading out. And still, O'Rourke wrote, still he gathered scraps, as if aware that history would not believe without the evidence of ink. The summer of 1889 brought heat so oppressive, it seemed to cling like a fever. Crops shriveled, tempers frayed, and illness spread through the county. Yet none so disturbed the records of that season as the case of the Herons, preserved chiefly in the ledger of Dr. James Holcomb. Holcomb was no man of poetry. His handwriting was square, his observations clinical, his tone devoid of flourish. Yet in his entries concerning the Herons, a note of unease bleeds through, as if even his trained detachment could not withstand what he saw in that house. June 12, 1889. Weight loss extreme, gums inflamed, skin of sallow cast, observed tremors in limbs, persistent nausea, and bouts of hysteria, strong suspicion of mercury or arsenic ingestion. Patient insists food and drink are tainted by husband. Household denies, administered tonic of milk and limwater. Prognosis guarded. Holcomb's suspicion of poisoning appears repeatedly in the pages that follow, though he never advanced it beyond the privacy of his notes. He had treated enough of the county's families to know that accusations against a man of Thomas Heron's standing would be ruinous, to physician as well as patient. July 1, 1889, visited Heron household upon urgent request, found Mrs. Heron semi-conscious, pulse rap evidence of hemorrhage, husband attributes to female complaint. I remain unconvinced, administered laudanum for pain. When alone with patient, she grasped my sleeve and whispered. He gave Eli the same. Her eyes begged secrecy. I could not answer. Left shake. Holcomb's clinical restraint falters here. His handwriting sprawls across the page, ink smudged, as if written in haste or agitation. While Martha withered, Thomas and Rose appeared in rude health. They were seen together at county fairs, at church suppers, even at a barn dance in late July. Neighbors whispered at the impropriety of a widowed bride appearing in such company so soon, but their whispers carried no force. What struck those who saw them was the vitality they exuded. Thomas, a man nearing 50, seemed rejuvenated, his step brisk, his voice commanding. Rose, scarcely 20, carried herself with the assurance of a matron. Together they radiated a disturbing harmony, as though Martha's decline fed their vigor. Holcomb, observing this, noted in his ledger, July 14, 1889, contrast between health of husband and companion versus wife increasingly stark, strikes me as unnatural. Wife near death, others thriving, suggests deliberate administration of toxicant, though impossible to prove. I fear conspiracy, yet remain powerless. It was around this time that rumors spread of strange practices within the Heron household. A farmhand dismissed in anger told O'Rourke that he had seen Thomas pouring powders into a pitcher before supper, instructing Rose to stir until dissolved. Another swore that Rose herself kept small packets hidden in her sewing box, which she would dissolve into tea before serving Martha upstairs. These accounts, unverifiable though they are, align too neatly with Holcomb's suspicions to be dismissed. In August, Martha's condition deteriorated beyond concealment. Her hair fell out in clumps, her voice rasped to a whisper, her skin broke into sores that would not heal. Servants reported she could no longer rise from bed, and that when she spoke at all, it was of Eli, not of his life, but of his death. One maid later testified to O'Rourke that Martha would whisper the same refrain each night before sleep, "The fourth cup, the fourth cup." When asked its meaning, she replied only, "Count the vessels and you will see." The maid, terrified, left service soon after. Holcomb's ledger for August 23 records his final visit to Martha. Patient near expiration, body emaciated, sores unhealed, tongue swollen, speech nearly lost. Attempted to administer morphia for comfort. Husband refused, stating, "Let her pass as she must." Patient fixed me with gaze most dreadful. Managed to articulate, "He will do the same to her," to the girl, then to the children. Whether delirium or prophecy I cannot say. Departed house shaken. She died within the week. The burial of Martha Heron was quiet, almost furtive. Few neighbors attended, though all had heard of it. Thomas arranged no grand service, merely a graveside prayer led by O'Rourke, whose voice broke midway. Rose stood at Thomas's side, not in widow's weeds but in a dark blue gown that caught the sunlight. The sight disturbed many. It was not mourning, wrote one observer, but triumph in disguise. With Martha gone, Rose assumed her place entirely. She was mistress of the Heron farm, mother to the children, and constant companion to Thomas. Yet her new role did not silence whispers. It deepened. The county now spoke openly of corruption, of a father who had taken not only his son's life, but his son's bride, and of a household steeped in sin. What troubled O'Rourke most was the effect upon the children. He recorded that young Ruth clung to him after Mass, whispering, "Father, Mother says the poison is in me now." When asked what she meant, the girl only wept, insisting she could feel it in her stomach. Whether this was imagination born of grief, or something more tangible, O'Rourke could not determine, but he added the account to his growing archive, convinced the family's affliction had become hereditary, whether through blood, mind, or spirit. By autumn of 8, Holcomb's ledger ceases mention of the Herons. Some say he refused further summons, claiming professional duties elsewhere. Others whisper Thomas threatened him into silence. Whatever the truth, the absence of his hand marks the transition of the story from clinical record to whispered legend. What remains are the testimonies of neighbors and the haunted writings of Father O'Rourke. These speak not of symptoms, but of signs, shadows seen at windows, voices heard in empty halls, apparitions that resembled both Clara and Eli, walking the grounds at dusk. It is here that the tale begins to pass from the physician's hand to the realm of folklore. Though no less dreadful for the shift, yet the ledger survives, brittle and yellowed, its margins stained with ink blots and fingerprints. In its pages the Heron decline is captured with clinical precision, yet also with the tremor of fear beneath the pen. Holcomb's final remark on the family, written after Martha's burial, reads, "I fear what festers here is not merely poison of the body but of the blood, the mind, if such taint passes to the next generation, God help the county." With that the physician closed his book. History, however, was far from finished with the Herons. The year turned. By October of 1889, the Heron household bore little resemblance to the farmstead it had once been. Where once children's laughter had drifted across the fields, silence now ruled, broken only by the caw of crows and the occasional creak of a weather-beaten shutter. Thomas Heron walked with the air of a man triumphant, his authority unchallenged, his power unquestioned. Rose, meanwhile, had assumed full command of the domestic sphere. She kept the accounts, directed the servants and managed correspondence with timber buyers in Little Rock and Memphis. Those who dealt with her remarked upon her intelligence, her grasp of numbers, her uncanny composure. But beneath this new order lay dread. Neighbors whispered of sickness and of strange rites within the Heron house. Some swore they had seen candlelight burning in the attic at hours when decent folk were asleep. Others told of hearing chants, voices doubled in unnatural harmony. Thomas's booming baritone joined with Rose's soft contralto. Father O'Rourke, now increasingly isolated, wrote in his journal, "Their household is bound not by matrimony but by covenant. I have seen it in their eyes, that pact of blood and ambition sealed not before God but before darker powers." The night of October 31, the story reaches a dreadful crescendo in the testimony of Sarah Mullins, a laundress who lived half a mile from the Heron farm. On the night of October 31, 1889, she was returning from her sister's home, when she claimed to have seen figures moving through the fields by lantern light. Curious, she concealed herself among the hedges. She swore she saw Thomas, Rose and the two surviving children, Ruth and Caleb, walking toward the oak grove at the edge of the property. Thomas carried a spade, Rose a small wooden chest. The children, pale and silent, walked as if in a trance. Sarah described how they reached the grove,
where Thomas began digging at the roots of the largest oak. Rose opened the chest, producing objects Sarah could not describe fully: bundles of hair, small bones, and a vial of dark liquid. She claimed Thomas poured the contents of the vial into the earth, while Rose murmured prayers in a tongue Sarah had never heard. The children repeated the words, their voices quivering but obedient. When the rite was done, Thomas replaced the soil and pressed his hand firmly to the ground, whispering, "Bound in flesh, bound in blood, bound in earth, until the line is secured." Terrified, Sarah fled and told no one for weeks. Only when Father O'Rourke confronted her about rumors of midnight gatherings did she unburden her tale. O'Rourke recorded it carefully, though he admitted he could not verify its detail. Rose's transformation. By the winter of 1889, Rose was no longer the uncertain young bride brought from Arkansas to wed William. She had become something else, formidable, commanding, her beauty sharpened into severity. Visitors noted her cold courtesy, her ability to silence a room with a glance. Some claimed she had begun dressing in Martha's old gowns, altered to her slimmer frame, as if to erase the memory of the woman whose place she had taken. Others insisted she had locked Martha's chamber, refusing even the servant's entry, yet was often heard moving about inside at night. It was during this period that Dr. Holcomb, though absent from the household, received a cryptic letter signed only F. The letter warned, "What afflicts the Harrens is not illness, but covenant. The children are in danger, for what was done to the mother will be done to them, unless the cycle is broken." The letter, preserved among Holcomb's effects after his death, bore handwriting unlike any of the Harren circle. Some speculate it was penned by Sarah Mullins, others by a servant who fled the house. The children's decline. By early 1890, Ruth and Caleb showed signs that chilled all who saw them. Their once bright eyes grew dull, their movements sluggish, their laughter gone. Ruth complained of stomach pains. Caleb suffered fainting. To outsiders, it seemed the wasting sickness that had claimed Martha was now repeating itself. Yet Thomas and Rose insisted the children were well, dismissing concern as gossip. They rarely allowed outsiders to visit, claiming the children required rest. One farmhand later testified that he had seen Rose dosing the children's milk with powders from a small glass vial. When asked about it, she told him sharply it was medicine prescribed by Dr. Hayes. Yet Hayes, when questioned years later, denied ever prescribing such remedy. The implication was clear. The children were being subjected to the same regimen that had wasted Martha, but for what purpose? Some whispered Thomas wished to purge all weakness from his bloodline, preserving only his dominion and Rose's favor. Others believed the children were sacrifices, necessary to secure the bond Thomas and Rose had forged. That October night in the oak grove, O'Rourke's confrontation. Unable to bear further silence, Father O'Rourke confronted Thomas directly in March. He rode to the Harren house and demanded an audience. In his journal, he described the exchange. "I accused him of murder, of poisoning his wife, of corrupting his son's bride, of endangering the souls of the children." He did not deny it. He merely smiled as a man might smile at a fly upon his sleeve. "Father," he said, "you mistake strength for sin. The weak die, the strong endure. It is the law of God, though you clothe it in gentler words. Rose and I are strong. You will not break us." O'Rourke left shaken, convinced he had spoken not to a man but to something already beyond redemption. The covenant sealed. Accounts diverge on what followed in the spring of 18. Some say the children grew steadily weaker, until both perished, their graves unmarked, their deaths recorded only in the parish book with chilling brevity. Ruth Harren, age 9, Caleb Harren, age 7, taken by illness. Others claim they disappeared altogether, their fate concealed, their names never again spoken. What is certain is that by midsummer, Thomas and Rose lived alone in the great house. Neighbors reported the property overrun with weeds, the servants dismissed, the shutters closed even by day. Yet on certain nights, lights glowed from the attic, and strange music, not hymn, not fiddle, but something slower, stranger, drifted across the fields. O'Rourke's final words. Father O'Rourke, exhausted and nearly broken, recorded his last reflections on the matter in a letter to the bishop, dated August 1890. "I have failed this flock. Evil has taken root not in shadows but in the bright center of our community, and still it flourished. The Harrens are not merely guilty of sin, they are architects of a new order, where covenant is stronger than kin, and appetite stronger than sacrament. If their line continues, it will curse this land for generations. I commend this record to the church, for one day the truth must be told, lest we forget what was done here." The bishop never replied. O'Rourke's health declined swiftly thereafter, as if the weight of his knowledge consumed him. He died before the year ended, leaving behind his journals, and a community too frightened to speak the Heron name aloud.
Thus ended the 7th chapter of the Heron tragedy, a household stripped of children, bound by a covenant whispered beneath oaks, and watched by neighbors who dared not intervene. But the story was far from over, for though the Heron house grew quiet, its silence was not the silence of peace, but the silence before the next storm. By the winter of 1890, the Heron homestead had entered a period of eerie stillness, where once wagon wheels rattled over the gravel drive and voices carried from the porch. Now the property lay as hushed as a mausoleum. Smoke rarely rose from the chimney. The front gates sagged, untended. Those who passed along the road swore that the windows, though shuttered, concealed movement shapes shifting in the gloom, watching with unblinking patience. It was during these months that the community's whispers hardened into legend. The Herons were no longer discussed in the casual gossip of neighbors. Their name became a warning, uttered in lowered tones, a parable told to children to keep them from wandering into the woods. The disappearance of the children, the matter of Ruth and Caleb, remained the deepest wound. Officially, their deaths were recorded as fever, an illness sweeping through the county in the spring of 1890. But no graves were marked, no services held. When neighbors asked, Thomas replied curtly that the children were buried privately on family land, as their mother would have wished. Yet no burial sites could ever be found. Field hands claimed to have seen Thomas carrying heavy bundles wrapped in cloth toward the oak grove at dusk. Others whispered that Rose herself carried the smaller of the two, her arms rigid, her expression serene. What exactly became of the children remains unresolved to this day. Some researchers believe their deaths were natural and merely hidden to avoid scandal. Others insist they were the final sacrifice, sealing the covenant. Thomas and Rose had begun the previous autumn. Rose's ascendancy. By mid-1890, Rose no longer appeared the grieving fiancée or the reluctant partner. She had blossomed into something more formidable. At local gatherings, rare though they were, she carried herself like a matron decades her senior, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Merchants in Little Rock wrote of her sharp dealings. She haggled with confidence, demanded precise accounts, and negotiated timber contracts with a fluency that astonished even seasoned traders. The lumber business, once William's inheritance, had become hers by sheer force of will. But beneath her success lay unease. Several clerks noted that she referred to herself not as Rose Heron, but sometimes as Rose of the House, a peculiar phrasing, as if she identified less as wife or widow than as custodian of something larger, older, and less personal. The death of Father O'Rourke. When Father O'Rourke passed in November of 1890, the town mourned deeply, yet some whispered that his death too was tied to the Herons. Officially it was pneumonia. He had weakened steadily through the autumn, his lungs failing in the chill of October night. But in his last sermon, delivered in a trembling voice, he warned his flock, "Beware the covenant of silence, beware those who prosper by graves unmarked, for the wages of such secrecy are not gold, but ash." Many interpreted these words as his final condemnation of the Heron household. Within weeks he was dead. The bishop appointed no replacement, leaving the parish without firm guidance. Some took this absence as proof that the church itself dared not cross the Herons. Neighbors' accounts, the few who ventured near the Heron farm after 1890, reported unsettling. December 1890, a farmer cutting timber claimed he saw lanterns swinging through the grove. Though there was no wind, he swore the light moved not like carried lamps, but like floating orb. January 1891. A child gathering kindling along the fence line heard singing, a woman's voice rising in slow, mournful cadences. When he told his parents, they forbade him ever to pass that way again. March 1891. A peddler delivering fabric found the front door open, though no one answered his calls. Inside he glimpsed Rose at the far end of the hall, her gown dark as ink, her hands clasped around a small bundle. She turned without a word and vanished into the parlor. These accounts spread quickly, fueling rumors that the Heron house was not merely cursed, but alive, feeding on those within. The sudden prosperity, despite or perhaps because of its growing infamy, the Heron estate flourished financially. By 1891, shipments of timber increased, contracts expanded, and profits soared. Workers employed in the mills noted that Thomas rarely appeared. Rose gave most instructions herself. Some said Thomas had grown frail, his hair graying, his step uncertain. Rose, in contrast, seemed untouched by time, her beauty sharpened, her energy unflagging. One foreman remarked privately, "It is as if she has stolen his years and made them her own." The elimination of witnesses. It was also in 1891 that death visited those who had once been part of William's hunting party. James Crawford, the mill supervisor, was found lifeless in his bed, declared a victim of heart failure. His widow confided to a friend that he had been troubled by memories of the woods, and had spoken of inconsistencies in the account of William's death. Dr. Hayes, who had examined William's body, perished months later in a supposed riding accident. His horse, usually gentle, had thrown him violently against a tree. With each passing season, those who might have challenged the official story were erased by accidents too convenient to ignore. Yet the community, bound by silence and fear, did nothing. Margaret's vigil. Among the few who refused to forget was Margaret Henley, sister to Harold Henley, one of the hunting companions. Margaret had been Rose's closest neighbor in those early days, and she had seen the glimmer of calculation in Rose's eyes long before others recognized it. By 1892, Margaret had begun keeping her own journals, recording every suspicious death, every whispered rumor, every inconsistency. She wrote of the Herons' midnight gatherings, of the children's mysterious fate, of the unnatural bond between Thomas and Rose. Her notes, preserved in fragments, reveal both her courage and her terror. One entry reads, "I fear I am the last who remembers what truly happened. If I fall, their triumph will be complete. Yet still I write, for ink is stronger than fear, and memory stronger than silence." Thomas's decline. In 1892, Thomas Heron's health faltered visibly. Neighbors who caught rare glimpses described him as gaunt, stooped, and unsteady. His booming voice, once the terror of farmhands, had shrunk to a rasp. Rose, by contrast, appeared vigorous, radiant even. This disparity gave rise to whispers that Rose was draining the life from Thomas, siphoning his strength, as she had siphoned William's inheritance, Martha's place, and the children's very existence. Some suggested that Thomas, though once master of the house, was now its prisoner, bound by the covenant he had initiated, unable to free himself from the power he had unleashed with Rose. The gathering storm. By late 1892, the Heron name had become synonymous with dread. Travelers avoided the road that passed the estate. Families whispered prayers when their children strayed too near the property, and yet, paradoxically, many admired the Herons' wealth and envied their They had become both spectre and monarch, feared for their rumored crimes, envied for their visible triumphs. It was during this period that the first tales of the forbidden marriage began to circulate in local lore. Neighbors, reluctant to speak directly of William's fate, couched their warnings in story. A father who stole his son's bride, who sealed a covenant in blood and shadow, who prospered, while all others withered. The legacy of silence. Looking back from the vantage of later decades, it is clear that 1890-1892 formed the turning point in the Heron saga. The deaths of Crawford and Hayes, the disappearance of Ruth and Caleb, and the decline of Thomas, all coincided with Rose's undeniable ascendancy. She had transformed from an orphan bride into the matriarch of a fortune, a woman whispered about as both enchantress and predator. And yet, through all of it, no charges were brought, no investigations launched. The community's silence was the soil in which the Heron legend grew. For silence, more than poison or bullets, is what preserves evil. Thus closes Part 8, a chapter of vanished children, erased witnesses, and a woman who rose from the ashes of scandal to become something far more powerful than a bride. But the silence of the Heron house was not eternal. In the years to follow, events would conspire to unearth secrets long buried beneath oak roots and whispered covenants. By the spring of 1893, Thomas Heron was a shadow of the man he had once been. Once towering in stature, commanding in voice, he now shuffled about the homestead like a forgotten servant. His hands trembled when he held a cup. His breath rattled with each climb up the stairs. Visitors described him as a man drained, like a lantern burning with no oil. Rose, by contrast, radiated vigor. At only 26, she had assumed full control of the Heron fortune, dictating shipments, negotiating contracts, and orchestrating deals that expanded their reach beyond Arkansas. She spoke in confident tones,
her handwriting filled ledger after ledger, her presence dominating every room she entered. It was said that when the two walked side by side, Thomas hunched and frail, Rose upright and composed, they appeared less husband and wife than daughter and decrepit father. Yet those who looked into her eyes swore they saw no pity, no affection, but something colder, possession. The house reordered. With William gone and the children erased from memory, Rose began restructuring the Heron home itself. Servants were dismissed, shutters were bolted, corridors locked, rooms that had once been lively with company were sealed off, left to gather dust. Most striking was the transformation of William's old chamber. The hunting trophies and books he had collected vanished without a trace. In their place, Rose installed shelves of legal records, timber contracts, and letters from investors. What had been a young man's sanctuary became her war room of commerce, the heart of her empire. Neighbors who managed to enter described the air inside as stifling, as though the walls themselves resented the intrusion. The vanishing of Thomas. By autumn of 1893, Thomas Heron disappeared from public sight altogether. When questioned, Rose claimed he was too ill to receive company. Some insisted they heard his coughs echo through the halls at night. Others swore that after midsummer, not a sound of him remained. In November, Rose hosted a small gathering at the estate, entertaining investors from Little Rock. During that evening, one guest wandered mistakenly into Thomas's old study. He reported seeing a chair positioned toward the fire, its cushion indented as though by recent weight. Though the room was empty, on the mantel rested Thomas's pipe, still faintly fragrant with smoke. Whether Thomas lived out his final days in seclusion, or whether his life ended months earlier remains uncertain. No death certificate exists, no burial was recorded. By the following year, his name had slipped quietly from all legal documents. The widow without mourning. Rose began referring to herself, not as Mrs. Heron, but simply as the widow of the house. She wore black gowns, not in grief, but in what seemed a declaration of dominion. At church, she sat in the front pew, unflinching beneath the stares of those who whispered about her. She gave handsomely to parish funds, yet declined to speak with parishioners beyond the most formal exchanges. Her donations silenced questions. Priests offered prayers for her household, but pressed no further about Thomas's absence. In this way, Rose achieved what no woman of her station should have: unchecked authority, cloaked beneath propriety, yet unchallenged by man or clergy alike. Margaret Henley's pursuit. Still, one voice resisted silence. Margaret Henley. Her private journals from 1893 onward reveal a woman consumed by suspicion. She recorded the inconsistencies in Thomas's supposed illness, the abrupt prosperity of the estate, the erasure of William's memory. In one chilling entry she wrote, "I believe Thomas is gone, not departed as we know death, but drawn into some covenant of her devising. Rose has become more than bride, more than widow. She is keeper of a house that feeds on its own blood." Margaret confided her fears to a select few, but her words fell on deaf ears. Many admired Rose's strength, envied her wealth, or feared her reach. Margaret stood nearly alone in her quiet rebellion, her ink the only weapon she wielded. The spread of influence. By 1894, the Heron name stretched far beyond county borders. Timber shipments reached Mississippi. Contracts extended into Missouri. Rose's signature became synonymous with reliability. Merchants praised her discipline, her ability to settle disputes without delay. But along with prosperity came unease. Business partners described her as courteous, but distant, her eyes fixed on unseen calculations. Even as she conversed, some reported that she asked unusual questions about inheritance laws, bloodlines, and the legitimacy of heir. One investor recalled her remarking, "Wealth is not merely land or timber, it is the marrow of a family, and marrow must be guarded." He admitted he did not fully understand her meaning, but the phrasing lingered with him long after. The year of shadows, the year 1895, brought a series of misfortunes to those who had once opposed Rose. A merchant who refused to renew her contract lost his warehouse to fire. A cousin who sought to contest the Heron estate drowned mysteriously in the Arkansas River. Each event might have been dismissed as chance, but taken together, they painted a darker pattern. It seemed that obstacles to Rose's authority dissolved as though by unseen hand. Meanwhile, Margaret Henley's writings grew increasingly frantic. She described watchers in the trees, lights moving across the Heron fields at midnight, and voices echoing when the wind carried over the oak grove. She confessed to feeling mocked, her sleep haunted by whispers calling her name. Her last coherent entry from late 1895 reads, "If I vanish, know that it is by her hand, though no mark may show, for Rose requires silence, and silence is the price of her throne." Margaret herself survived the decade, but her accounts grew disordered, her handwriting unstable. Whether her mind fractured under fear, or whether she glimpsed truths too heavy to bear remains unknown. The preservation of power. By the late 1890s, Rose was firmly established as matriarch of the Harren estate. She rarely smiled, rarely laughed, yet commanded loyalty from workers and fear from rivals. Legends began to crystallize around her. Some said she never aged, that her face, in 1898, looked no different than it had in. Others swore she could walk through the oak grove at night, and emerge at dawn without a speck of dew upon her hem. Children dared one another to approach the property, to see if her shadow stretched unnaturally against the walls. Whether truth or tale, these stories endured, passed from mouth to mouth, growing darker with each retelling, closing the century. As the century waned, the Harren house stood as both monument and warning. Behind its shuttered windows, Rose maintained her dominion, a widow who had begun as a bride and ascended into something larger, an emblem of ambition unmoored from conscience, a figure who turned bloodline into weapon. The community, long since accustomed to its silence, accepted her presence as inevitable. Few dared speak against her, fewer still remembered William's laughter, Martha's sorrow, or the children whose names faded from record. What remained was Rose, eternal and immovable, her black gowns trailing across the floors of a house that had devoured every rival, every witness, every voice but hers. And yet even she could not remain untouched by the march of years. The dawn of the new century brought fresh eyes to Arkansas, outsiders unbound by the silence of the old community, and with them came questions that would stir the embers of the Harren covenant once more. The turn of the century brought change to Arkansas. Railroads cut through pine and oak, factories rose along the river, and outsiders arrived with their ledgers and laws. Among them were surveyors, historians, and attorneys who did not share the silence that had shielded the Harrens for so long. By 1902, rumors about the vanished Thomas, the missing children, and William's accident began to resurface. Newcomers, unburdened by fear of Rose, asked questions that locals had long avoided, and though the house remained shuttered, its very silence drew attention. The last sight of Rose, the final documented appearance of Rose Harren, occurred in September of 19. She attended a county gathering to negotiate rail access for her timber shipment. Those present described her as eerily unchanged, still radiant, her skin unlined, her posture straight, as though no 15 years had passed since William's death. She spoke with conviction, signed contracts with a steady hand, and departed before dark. Witnesses remembered the sound of her carriage wheels receding down the gravel road, a sound they would never hear again, for by 1904, Rose vanished. No announcement of death was given, no obituary printed. The estate fell into disrepair, shutters sagging, the mill operations abruptly halted. Workers arrived one morning to find the gates locked, payroll unissued, and no answer at the door. It was as if Rose had been swallowed whole by the very house she commanded, the abandoned estate. By 1906, the Harren property had become a ruin. Windows shattered, weeds overtook the drive, and ivy crawled up the sagging veranda. The oak grove, once trimmed and orderly, grew wild. Children who dared sneak onto the land reported that the air inside the house was stifling, thick with rot. Yet they swore the grand parlor still smelled faintly of roses, as though her presence lingered in the boards. Local officials attempted to auction the property for taxes, but each effort collapsed. Bidders withdrew suddenly, contracts lost, deeds misplaced. Some claimed the papers blackened overnight, ink dissolving into illegibility. Eventually the county abandoned the attempt, leaving the Harren house to stand as a monument to decay. Margaret Henley's final testament. It was Margaret Henley who offered the last coherent record. By 1910 she was elderly, her health failing, but her pen still restless. She left behind a letter, sealed and discovered only decades later in a family trunk. Her words are chilling. Rose was no ordinary woman, nor Thomas an ordinary man. They bound themselves by covenant, sealed not in church but in marrow. The children were offered, William was silenced, Thomas consumed, and Rose endured. Do not mistake her absence for death. She is kept within the house, waiting for those who will knock again. Margaret died shortly thereafter. Some believed her claims the ravings of a mind broken by grief, yet those who read her testament decades later could not shake the conviction that she had written in sober truth. The fire of 1921. In July of 1921, lightning struck during a violent storm. Flames engulfed the Harren estate, consuming the wooden structure, until only the stone foundation remained. Locals rushed to the scene, but none dared enter. Witnesses swore that as the fire raged, they heard voices rising within, not screams of the dying, but chanting, low and resonant, echoing beneath the roar of the flames. When the storm passed and the house lay in ashes, nothing remained but blackened stone, and a single iron key, warped by heat. And yet, though the house was gone, the silence remained. Neighbors reported that birds would not land upon the foundation. Grass grew sparse, as though the earth itself refused to reclaim the ground. Lingering dread. Through the decades, the Harren legend persists. Hunters swore they saw lanterns moving through the oak grove at night. Travelers claimed they felt eyes upon them when passing the ruins. A few insisted they had seen a woman in black walking the property, her face ageless, her step deliberate. Local families taught their children never to wander near the Harren grounds. Even into the 1950s, the place remained untouched, the land unsold. The county marked it on maps, but made no effort to reclaim it. By the 1970s, the ruins had all but disappeared beneath vines, yet the stories endure. College students who dared camp near the foundation reported waking to find their fires extinguished and their supplies rearranged. One group swore their names were whispered in the night, though no wind stirred. Present day. Today, the Harren estate is little more than stone buried in weeds, the oak grove grown dense around it. Few venture there, and those who do often regret it. Historians researching Arkansas's darker folklore inevitably encounter the Harren story, the father who stole his son's bride, the children who vanished, the covenant sealed in silence. For some, it is merely legend, a cautionary tale of greed, secrecy, and but for those who linger too long near the ruins, the legend takes on flesh. Locals speak of black gowns glimpsed between trees, of roses blooming inexplicably along the stone in winter, of the sound of carriage wheels rattling across gravel where no road remained, the whispered warning. And so, as we close the account of the Harrens, let one truth be remembered: silence preserves evil, and silence is what allowed Rose to endure. The house may have burned, the family may have perished, but covenants sealed in marrow do not end with fire, they wait. If you pass through Arkansas, and find yourself near an overgrown grove where no birds sing, do not linger. If you smell roses in winter, leave at once, for some bargains are never broken, and some brides never rest. They are only waiting for another knock at the door.